Welcome to Wisconsin in Focus. I'm Bruce Walker, Great Lakes Regional Editor for the Center Square. And with me is Benjamin Yount, the Center Square's Wisconsin correspondent. Republican lawmakers pitch constitutional amendment to keep Wisconsin churches open. Are they closing Wisconsin churches?
Not anymore, they're not closing the churches. But you got to remember that during the early days of the coronavirus, churches in Wisconsin were ordered closed. Some of that was from local public health orders. You can't have more than 10 people in the building, which eventually morphed to, well, you really can't have anybody in the building anyway. Everybody just go home and don't do anything. Some of the church closings were decided by the churches themselves. Church leaders in whatever denomination, whatever faith, decided that it's just not safe to bring all of these people together. But this is a constitutional amendment. This isn't a new law. This isn't a new idea of let us hold back the rule promulgation authority of the Department of Health Services. This would change Wisconsin's constitution to spell out you have a First Amendment right to worship how you wish, and no one in government is going to be able to tell you that you can't go to church simply because of an emergency is the way they hang it out. But this is clearly of a public health emergency. And I remember writing stories at the time. I remember the point that many Republican lawmakers made on Twitter. They said liquor stores and abortion clinics are allowed to stay open during the pandemic, but God forbid you want to go to church and pray. And that was part of the argument from this handful of lawmakers who earlier this week went before a Senate committee to try and find support for this. Whether they did, I'm sure we'll talk about here in just a moment.
Right. Well, here in Michigan, it was, as you said, abortion clinics and whatnot were considered to be essential services, whereas religious services, not so much. And that became a little bit problematic. There was a lot of rending of garments and gnashing of teeth over the mandatory closure of churches and barbershops, I might add. So tell me, what is going to happen with this amendment?
Well, this is, an amendment in Wisconsin. I believe it's the same in every state, but an amendment in Wisconsin has to pass through the legislature twice. They've largely wrapped up their business for the year, but they could pass this and then pass it again next year. Then it has to go to the voters, and voters get to say yes or no. Just knowing Wisconsin and sort of knowing the voting trend, this will pass statewide. May not be that popular in Madison, but this will coast through across the state of Wisconsin. Outstate Wisconsin is still very conservative socially, and this is a very large Catholic state, so you will have an awful lot of people who will want to be able to go to church no matter what. But this is not universally popular. State Senator Andre Jacques, who is a conservative by almost every single measure, he was questioning whether or not this constitutional amendment is needed. And he asked the interesting point, and I lost the tape or I would share it with you. But he said there's a danger whenever you go and you enumerate, to use the big word, certain rights, that what happens is you say, all right, you have a right to do X. You have a right to go to church during a public health emergency. Boom, period, there you go. Jacques explained that there are people who will then take a look at that right and say, well, you didn't specify this or that or this thing or a third or a fourth or a fifth. And all of a sudden, what was a blanket right to religious freedom may be chipped away, may be lessened by specifying this one particular right to religious freedom. And Ty Bodden, who's one of the Republicans who's pushing this, said, look, this shouldn't be necessary, but in order to, as he put, bring light to this and hopefully right some of the wrongs, as we quoted him, he said this needs to be talked about, and Republicans need to do what they can to protect these rights. I think the better quote was the first quote we had from Karen Hurd, who said that this is an unconscionable threat to our very democracy, our representative republic, and the freedoms of every citizen in the state of Wisconsin. This threat is the disregard of our natural and constitutional right to the freedom of religion. And that's where this is going to become a very personal question for the voters of Wisconsin. That this is not a policy issue. This is not, should we spend a little bit more on food stamps, or should Wisconsin pave the road between here and there? This is an issue of faith. And at a time when, if you remember back to the late spring, early summer of 2020, we were scared. We as a people didn't know what was going on. And when that happens, people search for things that give them comfort, and faith is certainly one of those. And this here, 2023, 3 years past the time when churches in Wisconsin were closed, there is still this much passion, this anger, this many feelings about closing churches, that you have a group of Republicans who are willing to change the Constitution to make sure that it doesn't happen again. This is one of these ones that it sort of came out of nowhere. But when you actually sit down and take a look at the argument for and where this came, you can't be surprised that so many people are so passionate about this question of, should the government close churches ever?
Well, sure. And we're talking about a moment in history where this is yet another salvo in the culture wars between blue and red states, between blue and red families. And when the number one streaming song right now is the Jason Aldean song, and the number one movie, well, maybe not the number one movie, but certainly surpassing $100 million at the box office on a $14 million investment, is the film Sound of Freedom, which has a tremendous religious undercurrent to it. So this is one of those things where people are going to get rather passionate about, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, and while there will likely be some opposition from even some Republican lawmakers, this should sail through. As long as it comes up for votes, this should sail through both the Assembly and the Senate. And if voters get a look at this, they will absolutely pass it. I can go ahead and look into my crystal ball and feel confident in predicting that we can go ahead and call this one passed. If the bail reform constitutional amendment got 70% of the vote in Wisconsin, this thing is absolutely going to get enough votes to become a constitutional change.
Well, and that remains to be seen. And I certainly don't have my finger in the wind of Wisconsin politics or what the public at large seems to think about it. But I do recall seeing Tip O'Neill deliver a speech at my college back in the 70s, because I am that old. And a young woman in the audience asked him the question why he was not a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, and you know the story behind that. And his explanation is pretty much how you explained why some individuals would be opposed to passing this Religious Freedom Act.
When you start to go down the list and say, here's your right, here's your right, here's your right, everything that you don't put on that list all of a sudden may not register, and someone can make the argument that, hey, you had a chance here to enumerate, to list every single thing that's important to you, and you didn't list it, so I guess it's not that important. So I guess we can. And there is some danger in that, but this is, as I have said for years, red meat for the meat eaters, and they are hungry here in Wisconsin.
Gotcha. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Bruce Walker, Great Lakes Regional Editor for The Center Square. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.